So, welcome everybody. Lovely to see so many of you here. And this session is called We Need to Talk, which is a very emotive title. When you hear someone say to you, we need to talk, what does that spring to mind? Often it's a sense of fear or trepidation. So this session is about replacing fear with some clarity and a bit more calm when giving and also when receiving feedback as well. So we're going to talk about that too. So if you don't know me and who I am, so my name is Graham Allcott. I'm the founder of Think Productive. I'm also the host of the Beyond Busy podcast and the author of a number of different books, most notably How to Be a Productivity Ninja. That's my biggest bestseller. I'm sure some of you have come across that book before. But yeah, if you have questions or you want to just connect with me after this session, then feel free to email me. My email address is right there. And that's my website, grahamallcott.com, where you can fill in a little form and say hi there too. And Think Productive, if you don't know who we are, so I founded the company in 2009, and we're on a mission. We're on a mission to create a world where everyone can excel with clarity, confidence, and calm. And we have a very specific and particular way of working. So we're all about psychology before technology. So yes, there are some great tools out there, but it's how we think, how we tell stories to ourselves, the biases that we have. Those are things that really impact performance. So we start with technology before we move on to technology. We start with psychology before we move on to technology. We believe in a human, not superhero approach. So we believe in recognizing that the world is not perfect and neither are we, that we have limits and that we have no special powers. We are just humans with good skills and a good mindset and so on. We walk our talk. So I'll talk to you a little bit about, and Jess, my colleague, is on the call today as well. She'll be able to also share some stories of how Think Productive does this stuff that we're going to talk about today. And one of our values is also trust and kindness are our rocket fuel. We genuinely believe that when we have a culture of kindness in our organization, when we build trust in our organization, that actually drives performance. I've also written a book called Kind, which is all about kindness and leadership. And yeah, we'll be talking a little bit more about kindness as we go through this session as well. So the plan is for about half an hour. I'm going to give you some input, a few things to think about, a couple of different models to look at. And as we go through the session, if you want to use the chat function, then please just do chat. Often you will have more interesting things to say than the things I'm saying. So just put them in the chat. Start conversations that way. And there's also a Q&A function as well. So if you have questions that you want to come back to at the end, feel free to right now put them in the Q&A and we'll come back to them. So I'm going to talk about half an hour, then we're going to have about 15 minutes of Q&A. And then at the end, we'll do after dark. So if you can stay after 2:45, we'll just hang out and talk some more. So feel free to stay at the end of that session. We're going to talk about the difference between coaching, feedback, and input. We're going to talk about the purpose of giving feedback and, of course, how to do that well. We'll talk about some of the barriers that get in the way and really just the whole idea that our intent and the approach that we take really are everything when it comes to feedback. So yes, there are some really nice tools that we can use, and we're going to share a feedback model with you. But just like our mindset and the intent that we have and the relationship we have with the person that we're giving feedback to really is the most important thing. So a really good example, I guess, of psychology before technology. You know, it's all about the way we think and the way we tell stories with ourselves. So let's start with just like a really basic question, like what is feedback? And I think this is something that often people get wrong or can be kind of misconstrued. So when we think about feedback, let's start with a little definition. So feedback is the process of supporting an individual on their path towards, and then it's maintaining a standard of performance or behavior, or achieving a particular goal, or celebrating or improving something that's been delivered, which then reinforces that person towards doing more and doing better. And so the idea is it's either meant to reinforce something or redirect, and with the goal of achieving a pre-agreed upon outcome. This is the most important word on this slide. That pre-agreed upon is the most important bit. So when we think back to the etymology of the word feedback, so it's used in a lot of different scientific contexts, and only really in the 1950s did it start to be used kind of as a noun and in the way that we think about it today in a kind of business sense. One of the organizations that uses the term feedback a lot, which is why the little rocket is on the screen there, is NASA. So NASA uses the term feedback to talk about how it relates to its astronauts. So the astronauts are on the rocket and they're firing it towards the moon. The process of feedback is about saying, hey, you're 1% out, you're going to overshoot, you're going to miss the moon, or you're 1% under. So that process of feedback is about helping the astronauts to then course correct and get to their destination. So this idea of having a pre-agreed upon outcome, really, really important. If you do not have something that you've agreed upon that that person is trying to get towards, then really you're not giving them feedback. So we can talk about that in a second. So it's all about how do we maintain that standard? How do we improve performance? How do we hit an objective or a goal? And how do we then celebrate those things that go well, but with a very clearly defined and sort of pre-approved goal or target in mind. So that's really what we're trying to aim at here. So what's not feedback? So just with that in mind, it's not feedback if there isn't some kind of pre-agreed expectation. So we have to have had some kind of goal that's been agreed in advance. And so this is a really important question before you're about to give feedback, is asking that question. Does the person I'm going to give feedback to, do they know what the goal is? They know what our value is. They know what our expectation is. Like whatever it is that we're about to give them feedback on to help them course correct or to reinforce, do they know that that's something that they're supposed to be doing? So if you don't have that, then you're not really giving feedback. What you're doing is just giving input. You're giving ideas, but you're not actually giving them feedback that is something that they can then act upon. And also, you might have a pre-agreed kind of set of assumptions, but like, is there a specific end state or target? Like, is that quantified? So again, if you don't have that really clearly laid out, if that's not something that you've both pre-agreed upon, then what you're doing is you're sharing thoughts, you're sharing ideas or opinions, but you should only really do that if you're requested. Like, don't give that as feedback if you don't have that sense of end state or target or something that's quantified in mind. And yes, there might be opportunities for coaching in there or other things, but again, that would not be feedback. And then this is a really important one. So it's not feedback if what you're saying just comes from a really negative or destructive place. Remember, the idea is we're trying to course correct. We're trying to help that person to hit their target, which has two really important things in mind. Firstly is we need to be committed to what that target is. And the second thing is we have to be really committed to that person achieving it. And we have to be committed to that person being able to grow. Like, really good feedback is where we're holding space to help somebody to be able to get better or to reinforce something that's already gone well. So don't give feedback if you're in this kind of state. If you're upset with someone, if you're hearing yourself using phrases like, oh, that person never does this, or they're always doing that, then probably it's not feedback. And what it actually is you emotionally offloading. So really getting clear about, am I speaking in a way that is for that other person, which is committed to that other person trying to achieve something? Or am I just here because I'm a bit frustrated and I want to kind of let that out on somebody, and it just happens to be the person that's right there. So that wouldn't be feedback in that case. So I just want you to have a think for a moment. So just if you'd like to share some of this in the chat, then I'd love to hear it. But just more importantly, just to have a think to yourself for a minute. So what's the best feedback experience that you've ever had? So, it tends to be that when we're at work is more the scenario where we do get more pre-agreed upon kind of targets and goals and things that we can then use feedback towards. But so like in a work context, like what are the moments that you've really received really incredible feedback in the past? What was that feedback? What did you do, to change as a result of that? And also, what's the worst feedback experience that you've ever had? What made it bad? What was the feedback? What didn't you like about it? How did it make you feel? So there's something really important here about recognizing that there's a couple of, I think, really important points here. One is that often feedback on both sides of it feels uncomfortable. It feels vulnerable. It feels icky. It's a really difficult thing. And the other point that I really want to make is that, so when I started thinking about this, I thought of quite a lot of instances where someone had given me input. or had given me criticism, but actually very few examples where someone had actually given me feedback towards a pre-agreed goal. So often what you're thinking about as your examples might not be feedback. If I think for most people, we get a lot fewer instances of feedback than we actually realize. And that's obviously something that we can change and we can get better at, which is really what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. Some lovely stuff coming through on the chat. Thank you. Love it. Yeah, Helen saying I prefer feedback in person, not in emails. The best and worst was when I was told I like you now. Wow, that's a heavy one. So yeah, I think there's something really important here about recognizing the humanness of feedback and the importance of really thinking about our empathetic connections to each other when we're giving and receiving feedback. So with this in mind, here's the key to great feedback experiences. And the key is really simple. You learn to receive it graciously, and then you'll be able to give it kindly. So receiving feedback graciously, it's really difficult, and often something that the person says gets our hackles up. We start to feel really uncomfortable. But like recognizing that the person who is giving us that feedback, that's a vulnerable thing that they're doing too. So they're taking an interpersonal risk by giving us that feedback, and they're doing their best. They're trying really hard to give us feedback and hold space for us in a way that will help to make us better. But also they might be getting it wrong or screwing it up, and it might be difficult for them. And then likewise, when you're on the other end of it and you're the person giving feedback, that's difficult for you too. So just really recognizing that on both sides of this equation, it's really difficult. And the more we can put ourselves in that mindset of saying, hey, I'm giving some feedback now, but a couple of days ago I was receiving feedback and it was really hard. And so just recognizing both sides of that process, I think, can be really, really helpful in just terms of making sure that we're using those moments to really make empathetic connections with each other and actually build relationships. So if it's your boss giving you feedback, you're building a stronger relationship, even when feedback that you might be getting might be difficult, negative, might make you angry, and so on and so forth. So let's just think about that. So you're on the end of some feedback, you're receiving some feedback. What is that like? And I had a couple of people emailing me before the session actually just asking about this. It's like, you're going to talk about receiving feedback and the difficulty of that as well as giving feedback. So let's just talk about that real quick before we move on to a couple of models and things that you can use to help. So the first is like just really recognizing that if we can learn to receive it graciously, then we will give it more kindly. And so this idea of developing a feedback muscle is really important. So thinking about just having a mindset of feedback within your organization, within your team, and within yourself, it really helps to build that muscle and be on both ends of it as much as you possibly can. So that's really a mindset that I think is really important for team cultures to develop, is getting into the mindset of asking for feedback often, being prepared to give it regularly. And I think the more you can do that, the more you build that muscle, the easier it becomes to be on both sides of it. And then this is really important. So really seeing feedback as a gift that's going to help you improve. Question I think about quite a lot is the idea of, what is it like to be on the other end of me? And it's a really interesting question because it's a question that's very hard to get data for. And so what we need to do is really see feedback as one of the few opportunities that we actually have in life to really kind of hear some data and hear, some ideas about what it's like to be on the other end of me. That's a really difficult thing to, to achieve in lots of other ways. So seeing that as the gift that it really is, someone else is really taking an interpersonal risk. They're being vulnerable themselves. They're trying to, with your best interests at heart, give you some information that you might not like. And that's a really tricky thing. So just really recognizing that that is a gift. And of course, in that moment, just taking a deep breath, trying to think about and manage your own self-talk. So often when we start to get these, when we're in these conversations, when we get these pieces of feedback that feel difficult, we hear our lizard brain, right? Just like, oh, that's not me. And we get defensive, our hackles are up, all this kind of stuff. So just kind of really learning to manage that self-talk and focus in as much as possible on the information that's coming, the things that are being said, and not what you think is being said, but what's actually being said, and asking those kind of clarification questions to be sure of that too. And also just recognizing in that moment, just keep saying to yourself, this is the thing I try and do when I'm in this situation, is just constantly remind myself, I'm grateful for this. Even when I'm then feeling, angry or slightly taken off guard or confused or whatever the emotion is, like just bringing it back to, this is a gift. This is a gift. I'm grateful for this. I'm grateful for this. Just kind of managing that self-talk to become more positive rather than it kind of spinning out. Then it's about listening. So listening really thoughtfully, taking those deep breaths, trying to really figure out what has been said versus what do we think has been said, and maybe asking some questions to clarify that too. So just really clarifying what you've heard. So firstly, asking questions of the person who's giving you feedback. And then here's the really key bit when we receive feedback. After we've finished being in that feedback situation, is to ask questions of ourselves. So we're not really able to learn and change from stuff that we haven't reflected upon. So asking ourselves good questions, asking ourselves, is this a new thing? Have we heard this before? Is this part of a trend? Is this surprising? And maybe also asking some other people. So, hey, I've had this feedback from so-and-so. Is that something that you recognize? Do you think they're, sailing a little bit kind of wide of the mark there, or is that an accurate thing? Just kind of asking yourself and asking other people, just how credible, how useful that feedback really is. And obviously saying thank you at the end of the interaction. But like, here's also the really important thing is evaluating what you've heard, and it's a gift. It's been given to you, and therefore it's yours. So it's up to you to then think about what you want to do with that. So you can decide to take that really seriously, to take that on board. You might say, hey, I think this person has their own agenda here. This is not something that I really want to trust. This is something I'm going to kind of slightly detach from. So the reaction that you take to that should really depend on your own self-awareness, the questions that you're asking yourself and other people after that interaction, and then you kind of take that in terms of your learning. Okay, a few characteristics of effective feedback, and then I'm going to give you a little model as well. So making it specific. So analogies, stories, hypothetical situations, not that useful here. So being really specific, grounded in actual things that happened, actual things that you saw, actual behaviors, rather than kind of generalizations or stories. So be really specific. Doing feedback frequently. So the more you do it, the more you normalize it. I'll give you a couple of little quick tips about how we do that, I think, Productive in a minute as well. But just making feedback a really frequent experience makes it a more comfortable one. And it also means that you're just more developing that muscle between you and between the team to just offer feedback on a really regular basis. And then you're just more able to course correct and hit the moon and whatever it is that you're trying to do. Being balanced. This is a funny one. So I think a lot of people's kind of view of feedback, or the model that people tend to use around feedback, is, this idea of the shit sandwich, right? Or like the kind of sandwiching a positive and then a constructive and then another positive. I think that has its place, and I think that has its place if you're in a one-to-one type meeting, and what you want to do is kind of set the scene first and just build a rapport first before you then deliver the difficult part of the conversation. But I think in general, it can also have a really negative reaction. So I think people see through the shit sandwich very easily. And also it can, I think, create like a false sense that the bit that you're giving that's constructive is overly important, because it kind of needs this sandwiching with positive on either side. So I think when you just strip away those positives, you can actually have a more honest conversation around the thing that's constructive, that actually can be quite positive in itself, without then sort of having it contrasted with these positive things that just gives it more weight. And so I think you have to be really careful with using that kind of shit sandwich kind of model. Making it actionable. What can the person do as a result of this? What do you want them to do? What would you like them to do? And what do they do differently? And then here's a really key one: relevant. So what is what's the part of the feedback that's really critical to somebody's performance? So if you've come across my stuff before and how to be a productivity ninja and so on, you've probably come across the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle. This idea that 20% of what we do creates 80% of our value, and 80% of what we do creates about 20% of our value. So when we think about that model and we think about stuff in that way, there's lots of things where you might look at the way someone's doing something and think, hey, I wouldn't do it like that. But actually, it doesn't really change their performance that much. So feedback should really be focused on the relevant stuff, the stuff that will help someone to course correct and do that 20% of their activity that creates 80% of the value. So really focusing in on the big stuff, not being nitpicky and the small things, but really focusing on the stuff that matters in terms of the work that person's trying to do. And timely. If you're anything like me, my memory is terrible. I will often just like not remember stuff that happened last week or whatever. So doing, when you do it frequent feedback, obviously then lends itself to it being more timely, but giving feedback as quickly as you can after an event and after you've really sort of summarized your own position on it, rather than leaving things to kind of fester for weeks at a time. The more timely it is, the better it will be. And of course, kind. So one of the definitions that we use for kindness is about truth and grace. So kindness is committed to the truth of the endeavor. So you want to give feedback that is honest and that reflects the truth, but you're going to do that graciously. You're going to give that feedback with grace in a way that is for that person. So truth and grace, it's the salted caramel, right? Like the little bitter thing and then the sweetness around it. Truth and grace allows you to give feedback with kindness. So those are just different things to think about when we're approaching feedback. Here's a quick thing that we use at Think Productive, which just really helps to embed feedback within our culture. So just at the end of meetings, we try and ask one of these 3 questions or a couple of these questions. So just asking what's worked well in this meeting. Meetings are really great. And if you've read my book, How to Fix Meetings, then you'll know that one of the things I really suggest around meetings is to have a purpose statement, which is basically your intended goal for the meeting. So if I'm then asking as the chair of that meeting, what was useful about this meeting, what worked well, it's measured by what does that purpose statement say the goal was, like what were we trying to get to in this meeting. So there's a really clear, desired outcome of the meeting. And I can then ask for feedback. What's worked well? What's the even better if? And then just a really nice little model is stop, start, continue. So, this is a really good one. If I've given a talk and I want to make it safe for somebody to give me the feedback that's maybe a bit more difficult, it's like, what should I stop doing? What do you want me to start doing? What am I going to continue doing? So it's just a nice way of being able to, really look at things through those particular lenses, which just feels a bit safer than just coming out with, oh, I didn't like this, or that wasn't great, or that was confusing. So yeah, just really, kind of using that idea of debriefing to just help everybody in the room to develop that muscle as often as possible, to get good at giving feedback, get good at receiving feedback too. Okay, so a real quick little model that you can use, and then we're going to open this up for some Q&A in a few minutes. So here's the feedback model. This is really designed to be used in one-to-one kind of settings where you're about to have a conversation with someone. So the first is to describe the situation, really bringing it back to what I was just saying a moment ago about memory. Most people don't have a great memory for stuff that they were doing 3 weeks ago. So really kind of helping to start the conversation by putting you both back into that mindset, into that memory, picturing the situation, describing the situation before you get into the feedback, just to kind of refresh your memories, get everybody kind of on the same page in the right place. Second one is to explain the feedback, and remembering back to our NASA analogy, why have things gone off track? What's the thing that needs to be different? So really explaining that piece of behavior, or the thing that they said, or the thing that's gone wrong, and just kind of explaining how that looks from your point of view. And then the third one, a lot of people miss this one, and I think it's a really important one, explaining the impact of that. So that sounds a little bit obvious, but the reason this is really important is because this is the kind of what's in it for me part of the conversation. So the person receiving that feedback, it's like, okay, so what? and I'm already a bit defensive. So like, why does this matter? And so to bring that back to the impact. So what this meant was we're actually going to not hit our target, or what this meant was that person's really embarrassed, or this person, you know, feels unsafe, or whatever the situation is. So just explaining what that impact is will hopefully help to really get that person on side and really help you to both revisit the goal, like course correct, clarify what you need to do differently. Next one is discuss. So once you've explained what the feedback is, what the impact is, then opening up that discussion and leaving room for that discussion. So don't give feedback in the last 5 minutes of a one-to-one and then be like, right, we're done, I've got another meeting. Giving that person, you know, that discussion is, you know, really their opportunity to start processing it and reflecting on it and, you know, asking those clarifying questions. So making sure there's plenty of room for discussion. And then the last couple of parts of this are restating. So again, going back to here's the feedback, here's the impact, and just kind of reminding and wrapping up the conversation. And then the final one is summarizing and closing. So this is where you can do that little bit at the end there as you summarize and close to say, well, I'm really glad we talked about that. I know it was a difficult conversation, but I'm really excited about where this leaves us, what we're going to do next, and kind of puts you both on the kind of positive and on the front foot. A couple of things also that are really critical to delivery with this: approach and intent are everything. So your mindset around this stuff really, really matters. So the first thing to say around this is, what is your motivation for giving that person feedback? So really check that your motivation is about being kind, being for that other person, and doing it in a way that is going to help them to course correct, to drive their performance and for them to be better in the future. Thinking about what are your internal stories in this situation. So taking a few minutes to really understand, am I overreacting here? Am I, you know, biased by my sort of previous interactions with that person that's really affecting my own story that I'm telling myself about this situation? And really kind of making sense of that. And Brené Brown has a lovely thing where she talks about with any personal story that you have, like, is this the most generous interpretation of events for that other person? So really trying to see as generously as you can what that other person was trying to do, and making sure that you're assuming the best of people rather than you know, perhaps being kind of lost in your own stories. And there's a lovely thing that Maya Angelou says as well. She says people generally do the best they can with what they know at the time, and they make the best decisions that they can, and when they know better, they do better. So I think that's a really nice way of just summing up this idea of assuming the best, assuming the best intentions. You know, most people are not, in the way they go about things, malicious. Most people are you know, reacting often to their own stories that are happening, or their own emotions, you know, or doing things in ways that you know, there's a knowledge gap in what they're doing. But just assuming the best of people and starting from that you know, kind of mindset will actually just make the whole interaction go better. So really critical before you start giving feedback is just spend a few minutes just to check in with your own motivations and check in with how you're feeling before you start that conversation. And then I'm just going to wrap this up, just going back to our NASA analogy. So I just gave you there just a really simple feedback model. So let's just think about what that would look like if this was NASA. So NASA would start by, number one, describing the situation. So NASA is radioing in to our astronaut and says, hey, you're not on track to reach the moon. Something is going wrong here. And then explains the feedback, which is that, hey, we wanted to reach the moon by Independence Day so we could have this like huge big party. And that was what we had agreed. We all thought we were on track to do it by that time, and you're actually slow, or you're actually in the wrong place. So that's the feedback. We need to get back on track. And then NASA explains the impact of that, which in this instance is, well, we're trying to get to the moon. The whole world is watching. The press are there. The president is, you know, really rooting for this. This is going to be really embarrassing for us. That's the impact if we don't get this done on time. Then NASA allows the time radioing back into our astronaut for some discussion. So why are we not on track? What's going on? Is there something else that's kind of getting in the way here? And then restates, so, okay, I appreciate there's been a lot going on here. We had some other problems, but we did agree that we're going to get there by Independence Day. We still need that to happen. Here's how we're going to get back on track, and agree the actions, and then summarizing and closing. So just a really simple, sort of idea of how you can use that really simple feedback model to just guide a conversation through those different stages. Okay, so we're going to head into some Q&A in a moment. I was 2 minutes over my own course on that one, so you can course correct me on that with some feedback at the end. Just before we do that, so I want to tell you about a thing that we've got coming up, really important program that Think Productive has been launching. It's part of a series that we're doing on leadership and management, and it's called the High Performance Manager. So this is it's a 3-month-long program. It's a public program for 20 people. We're going to be doing this as well in-house. So if you want to bring this in and do this with your entire management team, we can do that too. But we're doing a public program which starts next month. It starts on the 19th of April, and it's over, there's 3 months, 6 different workshops as part of it, with 6 different subject matter experts. There's coaching in between. There's a whole group element to really help you make the learning stick. And we're going to be covering understanding your management style, different approaches to productivity and well-being and work-life balance. We're going to be looking at delegation skills, really important for any manager, delving a bit deeper into this idea of giving feedback, and also making space for what matters, making sure that the work that you're doing and the way that you're managing is really focused on that 20% of stuff that adds 80% of the impact. So that's the High Performance Manager. If you want to find out a bit more about that, there's only 20 places, quite a few of them have been taken up already. So if you want to sign up, basically what we need is your commitment to the program. And then just head over to the website. So I'll give you the URL right there. It's thinkproductive.co.uk/apply. If you're interested, you can also DM Jess, who is here on the call as well, and just find out a bit more. But it's a really exciting new program that we're developing here at Think Productive. So it's probably worth saying that a lot of people, when they think about Think Productive, what they think about is how to be a productivity ninja, getting your inbox to zero. And as you'll see, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we do outside of that, really to help you to make space for what matters within your team, and to develop those really important, what are often referred to as soft skills, but what I really refer to as the hard skills. They're the stuff that's difficult to master, and the stuff that I think just really makes a difference in organizations. So of course, all of that is available as workshops where we can come in-house and work with your team. And then of course, we're running public programs as well. And then every Sunday I do this email. It's called Rev Up for the Week. And the idea is it's a positive or productive idea for the week ahead. It lands in everybody's inboxes at 4:05 p.m. on a Sunday and just sets you up for the week. So that's totally free. If you want to sign up for that, just go to grahamallcott.com and sign up. Some of the stuff that you've heard today, and just loads more besides. I tend to write them during the week. So it's kind of whatever's on my mind, whatever I'm thinking about, reacting to stuff that's in the news, that kind of thing. But yeah, if you want to get on board with that, it's free. Just go to grahamallcott.com. Okay, let's open it up for questions. I had a couple of people send me questions on email in advance as well. So I've got some questions here, and I know there'll be some in the chat and on the Q&A. So Jess, I don't know if you've got any questions there that you want to just read out. Do you want to kick us off?
Yes, so Sarah's asking about the Kind Leadership book.
Yes, so those of you who don't know, I've just written a book which is called Kind. It's all about how, like, the idea is to dispel this myth that the way to succeed in business and in work is by being a bastard, and that basically making the case scientifically for kindness. There's a lot of science around this. It's going to be out in spring of next year. I don't have the exact date, but if you sign up for Rev Up for the Week, then I'll be sharing more from the book over the next few months. And obviously you'll be first to know when there's pre-orders available and all those links go out and stuff. So sign up to Rev Up for the Week and you'll get more from there. And also I'm doing, if you also sign up to Rev Up for the Week, in a couple of weeks, you're going to hear more about a particular program that I'm doing with my colleague, Chris Kisley, all about kindness and leadership. So that'll be kind of a Zoom-based program as well. if you want to find out about that more, just go and sign up for RevUp.
Exciting. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. So how do you turn bad feedback into good feedback? For example, if you receive some feedback, but it's not delivered in a useful way, makes you feel defensive or confused, how do you save that situation and make it positive?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's probably there's like two prongs of the fork in the road that we can go down with this one. So the first is, I think it's really worth saying and restating that not all feedback will be valid, truthful. And there's a lovely phrase, which is stories, mine, yours, and the truth. And yes, there'll be times where your story isn't the truth. There'll also be times where the person giving you that feedback might also be completely biased and completely off track and so on. So I think it's worth just starting that with, it might be negative feedback because it's just not true or it's not valuable. So just, there are instances there where we just don't need to turn that into something positive. On the flip side of it, I think it's really important to use that data as the starting point, but then to get more data. So either to go back, to that same person who's been giving you feedback a day or so later and say, hey, I've been thinking about this. Can I just check I understand this? Can I just have another conversation with you about this? I think that can be a useful starting point. And also then asking questions of other colleagues that might have been in that same room or who know you, do you think this is something that's reflective of who I really am and the way that I'm working on, how did you see that situation? So I think the questioning part of this is really important. So as I was saying before, once someone has given you that gift of feedback, it's yours. And so it's totally up to you to decide how much of that you're going to take on, how much of it is useful, how much of it's worthy of extra investigation. The one thing I'd say around all of this is that building up your muscle around that will help you to be less defensive. So the more you're offering feedback, having those more vulnerable conversations, the easier it'll be to be on the other end of them. And so I think we tend to build this stuff up and make it feel really sort of fearful when we're just not doing it regularly. So just like anything, the more we practice this stuff, the easier it becomes to turn those things that are a bit uncomfortable into more positive things.
Yeah, I definitely used to be somebody who did not see the gift in feedback. I used to find it very difficult, be very defensive. I'd just say, thank you, and that would be it. And then the other person didn't know, did I find that useful? Have I taken it on board? Am I confused? And so, doing it more often and being brave and asking for it does really help when you
and I think we've obviously been doing that within Think Productive a lot more over the last, it's kind of been one of our little agendas over the last kind of 6 to 9 months or so, hasn't it, where I think we're all more in that headspace of wanting to build the muscle and kind of being committed to that and being committed to kind of helping each other to grow around that stuff as well.
Question here from Mary. So you mentioned being balanced, but that the shit sandwich isn't the best approach. Do you have any hints and tips for how to make feedback balanced and feel less confrontational?
So I think the balance doesn't always, so the thing with the shit sandwich is it feels like it's balanced in that moment, right? Whereas I would see balance in a slightly different way, which is the more you can regularly give feedback, and the more you're so I do this thing in the Kind for Leadership program where we call it the 4 quarters challenge, and it's like based on American coins. So you hold 4 coins in your pocket, and then the idea is as you go through the day, you've got to offer 4 different bits of feedback or ask for 4 different bits of feedback. So it really kind of develops that muscle. And when you're in that really intentional mindset around of wanting to give and get more feedback, more of it ends up being positive because there's so much positive stuff that almost just goes unsaid, or people don't think that they need to give that reinforcement feedback. So I would see the balance as more over a longer term rather than just in one meeting or one conversation. So the shit sandwich gives you balance in that moment, but actually it's better to look at balance more broadly and say, hey, over the course of a week, I've given loads of really positive feedback, I've received some really positive feedback, and then there's been a few bits that were a bit more constructive and uncomfortable. So I think kind of looking at it that way really helps. But then if you are in one of those conversations, I would say it's probably particularly if sometimes you enter those conversations knowing there's about to be, you know, a difficult conversation, right? So it's like, you know, when you've had that email that says, hey, we need to talk, then you kind of know there's going to be some constructive, uncomfortable feedback coming. So, you know, my approach is more like, let's just cut to the chase. You know, let's start with that and then end with the positive, which is just, I feel that like trying to end it with a kind of positive resolution of, hey, looking forward to what's to come. It's going to be different. It's going to be better. Really grateful we were able to have the conversation. I think is a much better way to sort of end it than kind of, I'm also going to give you, you know, I think you, you know, you sent a really good email yesterday, or just like coming up with some like false tokenistic positive to sort of sandwich the negative. I think just people see through that and don't necessarily take it in the most positive of ways sometimes.
Question here in the chat. Do you think the struggle to give or receive feedback is related to our desire to be seen as a good person rather than working on being better every day? Yeah,
man, that's a good question. I think it, it's a very wise question. I think, so going back to something I said towards the beginning, I think it's one of the kind of richest human experiences, I think, is the idea of personal growth and being committed to, you know, seeing yourself as, you know, human, not superhero, imperfect, and kind of constantly on a sort of slow evolution of being the best version of you. And I think, you know, seeing feedback as a real gift in that sense it's important, because it's one of the few places that we do actually get that data and we get that ability. So I think seeing it in that way is just like, it's the only way to, you know, A, it makes it like, it helps you to grow that muscle, and B, it just makes it more palatable, because it's like, even though I might find this really difficult, really uncomfortable, I know there's something good that's going to come from this. I know it comes from a good place. So I think just starting with that mindset, really, really valuable. Love that question. Should we do one more, Jess, and then we'll wrap up an After Dark?
So do you have any tips for giving feedback to people who ask for feedback but respond defensively?
That's a good question. So people are asking for feedback but then responding defensively. So I think, like, it's good to know where somebody's limit is. I think that's a really important part of it. So recognizing, hey, it just like when you can see that someone is really, you know, in a thought process, in a mindset that's based around fear, that's based around the lizard brain, that's reacting in that kind of way, they're just not hearing whatever you're going to say next. So I think in those instances, you're probably better off trying to wrap up the conversation as quickly as you can, and then coming back to it a day or so later. You just give them a chance to transfer a lot of that conversation and self-talk from their lizard brain, you know, kind of more defensive reaction into a more rational reaction, which will come later. But in that moment, if they're acting in a really defensive way, or the way they're saying, or, you know, the way they're interacting with you, just leads you to suggest that they're really on the defensive, then, you know, my sense would be trying to kind of wrap that up as quickly as possible and then return to it when it just feels a bit calmer. There's nothing wrong with letting the dust settle with some of these things, and sort of coming back to them kind of as in as timely way as you can, but you know, knowing that someone's in a slightly better place to hear it, for sure. Cool. That's our time, everybody. So just want to say thank you so much for being here. I'm going to put back on the screen the details for here we go. So that's the URL. So if you want to sign up to that new program that we're running, then just head to thinkproductive.co.uk/apply, and there's a load more details, by the way, on that URL as well. And so it's part of this series of 3 new leadership and management programs that we're launching. This is the first public one. We're really excited about it, and spaces are filling up, so get in there quick, put your application in, and we look forward to seeing you there. We're going to stick around, so we're going to do another 15 minutes or so on After Dark. There's more stuff going into the chat and more questions in the Q&A, so we're just going to hang out and we can just jam a little bit more on this topic. You can ask me anything else. Yeah, we're going to be here until 3 o'clock. So if you're logging off now, thank you for joining us. It's been great having you, and we'll see you again soon. And if you want to stick around, stick around. Lots of people saying thank you, that's really cool. Jess has put the link in there to recording, and yes, we'll put this on YouTube as well. People saying love Rev Up for the week. Oh, that's really nice, thank you. I haven't written this Sunday's one yet, so if anyone's got any ideas, what do you want in Rev Up for the week this week? How were the slides created? Software tool, they're a lot of fun, a bit distracting, but they made a lot more job. Jess, do you know, like, what does Klein use apart from, so we were just in PowerPoint, but does Klein use Canva or anything for any of the animation?
No, it's just Photoshop. Yeah, we just have
okay.
Very talented graphic designer Klein, who uses Photoshop for it.
Jess, can you do me a favor and just log that feedback? Let's give positive feedback as well. Charlotte saying signed up, love it, thank you. Will you be answering questions sent by email? So I've actually got a printout of some questions sent by email, so let me just go into those questions. So the first question was that got an email was, what are the 5 steps that we should take right after we receive feedback? So I think I covered some of that, but basically the idea of managing your self-talk, taking a deep breath, like really pausing and trying to focus in as much as possible on what's actually being said rather than what you think is being said, what your lizard brain is telling you is being said. So I think that's a really important first step, is like when you're in that moment, really just honing in on like the facts of it, and the, getting as accurate a picture in your brain of what that conversation has actually been about and what are the things that are actually on the table there. How can I get better at not letting feedback affect my self-esteem? For me, I think this is all about, it's about curiosity and it's about reflection. And I think, so if you look at a lot of the psychological models around learning, the really important component of those models tends to be the idea of reflection and then hypothesizing what the improvement is going to be. So if you get something wrong, you don't just need to know that you got it wrong. You also need to know what would you do differently to make it, right next time or better next time. So I think that's, for me, a really important thing is, that's then that shouldn't be about your self-esteem, because that should be about you saying, hey, I'm okay with being imperfect. Like, I know that I'm a work in progress. And when you start from that viewpoint, then you know that you're constantly on a kind of a continuous cycle of improvement the whole time. So I think that's a really good sort of mindset to start with. And then the other thing to say is that, yes, you will have times where people are dressing up their own negative emotions, their own attitudes, their own biases as feedback to you, and it's not feedback. And so we talked about some of the instances of that. So don't let those things get in the way of your self-esteem. For the same reason, I have a rule, which is I don't read reviews of my books on Amazon. I did it once and it felt horrible, and I've just never done it again. And I've heard a lot of people, I don't know who this quote was originally attributed to, but I've heard a lot of people over the years say, when you read reviews, it will generally tell you a lot more about the other person than it does about you or your book or your holiday resort or whatever else. Holiday reviews are a really good example of that, right? Like when you read holiday reviews, you very quickly form a picture of the bias of, the lens that person's looking at it through, or the bias that they're coming from. And so I think it's really important to just recognize that that's part of feedback too. And part of our jobs is about protecting ourselves from some of those things that are not necessarily true, not necessarily coming from a place of kindness or truth and grace, and where someone's actually just lashing out in a more malicious way because they're not handling their own stuff and their own emotions. And then the last one I've got on here is, what's the best advice you'd give to someone that is receiving quite heavy feedback? And one thing we didn't talk about actually is so I'm a big believer in coaching and having a space outside of your company, having a space outside of your line management relationship to just talk to someone a bit more objectively, and use them as the sounding board for your own sense making. So I think that's a really useful thing when you've received heavy feedback, difficult feedback, feedback that really goes against your own sense of self. So having that sounding board, using that to then make sense of it, using that to process the emotions of it, you kind of need to do that outside of the line management relationship or the colleague relationship, that from where you receive that. So I would say always like finding the outlet and the space for that's elsewhere. And that might not be a coach, that might be your partner at home or a friend or something else, but having that space to really kind of make sense of it and talk it through will hopefully help to kind of limit the damage. Yeah. One of the definitions of kindness that I talk about in the new book is there's a lovely dictionary definition of kindness, which is kindness is about limiting damage. And I think for me, that's a really good example of self-kindness, where using coaching or confiding in a friend or therapy or whatever else it might be, talking that stuff through can just help to kind of limit the damage of some of those things. Cool. We've got a few more minutes. Have we got any? Is there any other questions in the chat, Jess? I think the Q&A is.
Yeah, I got a question here. Even with good intent and positive feedback, I still worry about the breakdown of relationships with people, it being taken negatively and then viewing me and my help in a negative light. How can I make sure this doesn't happen, even with balance?
How can I make sure this doesn't happen? I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I'm going to say it will happen, right? It will happen sometimes. And I think it's useful to start. It's useful just to start from that mindset, because it then creates the assumption that you can't be perfect and you can't perfectly control how everybody else receives stuff or reacts to stuff. So I've definitely had it over the years where in certain situations people have responded a lot more strongly or a lot more negatively than I possibly expected with stuff. And sometimes that's about me getting it wrong. And also sometimes that's just about them overreacting and there was nothing else I could do in that situation. So I think it's worth like embracing there will be a little bit of chaos with this stuff. That's what makes it vulnerable. That's also what makes it important. So I think that's useful as a kind of place to start. And then I think probably the other thing to try and mitigate that damage or to make it as kind as possible is just to check that the space is safe at different points. So what a lot of people don't do is maybe at the start of giving feedback say, hey, I've got some feedback I want to give you, like, are you okay with that? And just really kind of creating that permission. It's often a very loaded question, isn't it? So it's a difficult thing sometimes to really navigate that in a way that's really authentic. But I think being able to sort of create that space where it's like, hey, I'm going to give you some feedback, but also I feel really awkward about this, and just creating a space where you're being as vulnerable as they are, I think can be a really helpful thing. And you're asking permission to give it rather than just giving it. I think those are things that can just really help. And then again, like I said before, so if you really start to feel like the reaction is very negative, or it feels like it's blowing up a lot more than you're expecting to, then that's the time to pull back rather than to try and get to the end of the notes that you've written down or the script that you have or whatever, and just kind of do it in a different way. But I do think it's probably difficult and uncomfortable, but important to just recognize that you won't always get it right, and also nor will everybody else. Like, we are all weird. We all come at stuff with our heart on our sleeve, and with emotions that can be difficult to process and manage. So I think it's just kind of worth recognizing, acknowledging that sometimes that is going to happen. Things won't always go as you expect them.
We've got a couple more questions in the Q&A that we get to in the last few minutes. What do you think about safe spaces in general? Is there a danger that people end up being unable to deal with any feedback, criticism, or challenge?
Yeah, that's one of those questions, isn't it? Where it's like, my answer could get me cancelled. Right. But I think so the way I think about a lot of this stuff is that I think for me it's all about intent, isn't it? And so I think safe spaces, the idea of safe spaces comes from an intent, which is let's try and create a sense of psychological safety so that people feel valued, people feel included, people feel able to contribute to whatever the situation is, whether that's online, whether that's in a team meeting, wherever that space is. I do think that sometimes that good intent can sort of stray to the point where it might make it it might create a sense of entitlement or an assumption that someone should never be in an emotional state or a space where they are remotely unsafe. And I think if you want to grow, and if you want to be in an environment where a team of people are growing, and you want to be in an environment where a company or an organization is growing, there's going to be some discomfort along the way, and so I think it's more important to focus on how do you air those differences well, how do you give feedback well, how do you really transmit kindness. I think that stuff's more important than always focusing on the process of a safe space, if that makes sense. Or like what are all the different ways and that we can presuppose making this as safe and as as kind of like ironing out the creases as possible. I think there's always it's always better to start from a point of view of let's be as kind as we can, and let's pull each other up when we screw up, but also let's give ourselves permission to screw up sometimes as well.
Yeah, you can always, you just never know sometimes how someone might react, so you could spend all that time on it and still get it wrong. So just safe space to get things wrong as well.
I feel the same about a lot of the conversations that happen around sort of like cancel culture and stuff. It's like, I think it often gets really overlooked whether someone was coming at that thing with a malicious intent, or whether they just stumbled into something and kind of stubbed their toe on something that they didn't quite understand or just got a bit wrong. And so I think it's like, I think that intent really matters. And then it's about being open to, did my impact not match my intent, and being open to that possibility. I think there's one more. There's one more question?
Yeah, we've got one more and 1 minute to go. So how does someone deal with a negative spiral from receiving or giving constant negative feedback?
Read that again.
How does someone deal with a negative spiral from receiving or giving constant negative feedback?
Okay. So I'm thinking that by spiral, I don't know how you interpret that, Jess, but I kind of interpret that as like, if someone is on the receiving end of negative feedback, then they're emotionally spiraling.
Yeah.
So
that's how I understood it. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my take on that would be, the first thing is to try and ensure that it's not, the negative feedback isn't the constant, right? So that comes back to the balance thing. And so making sure that if you're worried about someone being on the receiving end of that, are you creating the culture of feedback more generally, that there's a lot of other positive stuff going on and positive reinforcement, as well as that negative constructive feedback too. So that's the first part of it. And then I think the second part is, if you're in that situation, right here, right now, you're giving some feedback, and then that person is really negatively responding to it, and you can really feel that it's that lizard brain reaction, then like, I think for me, it's no longer a safe place for you to be giving more feedback or more constructive feedback, because they're just not going to hear it. So I think once you get into that space, it's like trying to shut that conversation down and revisiting it. Hey, let's come back to this tomorrow. It's been a long day, just whatever it is that can just close that down, I think. And then come back to it when they've had a chance to kind of reflect and perhaps are expecting what else is to come, I think the balance is as much about culture as possible, isn't it? It's like trying to create the culture where, because feedback is much more regular, then there's more of an opportunity for the kind of positive, reinforcing we're on the right track kind of feedback, as well as the kind of course correct feedback. Cool. Thank you, everybody. And we're at 3 o'clock, and 41 of you have stayed for after dark. So yeah, thank you so much for sticking around. I hope that was useful. Make sure you're signed up to Rev Up for the Week. Have a look at the leadership and management programs that we were talking about. And also we have a whole bunch of other stuff at Think Productive that we can help you with. So if you ever need help with getting inboxes to zero, fixing meetings, understanding your management style, understanding the 4 tendencies, all these other things that we work on, give us a call. We'd love to help. We'd love to come and work with you and your team and your organization, and help you fly to the moon. So thank you for being here, and you'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.